just going to go in the order on the program. And like the last panel, I'll just introduce each person before their talk. So, Salama with Mecca is an assistant professor at the Department of Amharic Language, Literature, and Folklore at Azabala University. She is also a research fellow at the Department of Greek and Latin Studies, University of Johannesburg. She is currently working on Royal Chronicles written for women in medieval Ethiopia. And the title of her paper is Ethiopianizing Foreign Heroines, the Reception and Adaptation of Female Saints' Hagiographies to Ethiopic Christian texts. Join me in welcoming Salama.
Thank you very much. Before I start, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this wonderful conference. Since the middle of the first millennium of our era, Ethiopia has been the development of two manuscript book cultures which seem to have evolved separately on geopolitical territories for a long time, distinct in the service of different religions and administrations. These Christian and Islamic manuscript cultures also developed in various languages and scripts, which have compartmentalized research on the subject. While the historiography of Christian manuscripts is already well-rooted, Islamic manuscripts up until now have been little studied. However, research today in Ethiopian books and manuscripts, both on Islamic and Christian cultures, renews the questions as to the points of contact between the histories of these books, whether they were produced in Ethiopia or whether they are to be sold in the exchange between Ethiopia and the neighboring countries such as Egypt, Sudan, and the more distant West Africa, or even further east in Yemen or India, as they left their mark on the texts or in the different aspects of manuscript books. One could study the connections between the different manuscript book cultures of Ethiopia only as texts, knowledge of, and traditions which they conserve and convey, but above all as objects having different characteristics and a matter of specific know-how. One could also explore the different periods of history of these books, but emphasizing the points which permit a comparative reflection on the production function and use of these books. In this paper, I will focus on the interplay with the medieval manuscript culture established by the actions and motives of its participants and the characteristics of the used and produced spaces, focusing on the manuscripts of female saints. To put it differently, my focus rests on the human networks of producing, distributing, and consuming, and on the interconnectivity of geography, distance, and space that shaped medieval production, circulation, and consumption. As an African civilization of late antiquity, the Aksumite kingdom participated intensively in cultural environment and exchanges between the Middle East and the Mediterranean and the Red Sea during the 4th century, right down to the 7th century. More than that, Ethiopia has retained some features of this cultural movement, be they religious practices, literary texts, artistic motifs, or elements of material culture. Several sources indicate that the introduction of manuscript books of Ethiopia seems to be started by the work of the 9 saints, whose arrival in the second half of the 5th century from Egypt is believed to be the groundbreaking in the history of Christianity in Ethiopia. According to the information deduced from their lives, they contributed greatly to the development of the Ge'ez liturgy and literature by bringing religious works from Egypt to Ethiopia and using them through their missionary work. Using their knowledge of Syriac and Greek, they also undertook the task of translating the whole Bible into Ge'ez. During those times, the only way that foreign manuscripts could enter the country was for religious purposes in one way or the other. Most of the other hagiographical writings circulated in Ethiopia after the 5th century believed to have come from the Mediterranean area. It was the time where books of foreign saints were the first to be recognized. As Stephen Kaplan, 2005, states, the stories were very much influenced influenced by Copto-Arabic and Greek traditions of the early Christian church. The Book of Saints not only empowered Christianity as the main religion, but also strengthened the country's cultural, social, and most importantly, its literary record. After the translation of the whole Bible into Ge'ez, the urgency of getting dependable and abundant writing material was absolute. Therefore, the manufacturing of vellum started to develop in the 5th century and continued to grow almost for 1500 years until the 19th century, when paper began partially to be used. The ancient and deeply rooted practice of parchment manuscript production was certainly favored by the dry and healthy climate of the Abyssinian highlands. After the late 4th century, there has been diffusion and transmission of the literary corpus translated from Greek into Ethiopic, which is instrumental to Christian practice, including the Bible with several apocrypha and various patristic writings. These Aksumite corpus survived in the course of time through complex process of translation. Some parts survived through copying, while other texts came down to us as translations from Arabic into Ethiopic. All these were transmitted on parchment. Interestingly, from the 10th century onwards, copyists probably did not speak the language of the texts that they were copying. There are only approximate estimates of the number of Ethiopic manuscripts in the Eritrean and Ethiopian regions. The distribution of manuscripts across the vast territory with a very limited concentration in bigger central institutions and an extremely marked tendency to wide dissemination is a feature that seems to go back to the time of establishment of the first monastic settlements in the late antique period, and that was perpetuated in medieval and later periods. Bowsy and other scholars explain that the process of manuscript production underwent its own development, and it involves different individuals. There are people who make the parchment, and there are people who copy the manuscripts on the parchment. The copying can be done by one person or a group of people depending on the size of the manuscript. Calf and horse skins are preferred to thick books, which consume a great amount of wet vellum. It is estimated from one horse, one can obtain 16 leaves of large-sized manuscript. The scroll does not seem to be popular for serious works in Ethiopia as in some other Middle Eastern countries. However, it has been used and still is used for magical prayers. On average, the scribe needs a year to finish a large manuscript and about 6 months for a minimum size manuscript. At any rate, he does not seem to be able to produce more than 2 books in any 1 year. At an institutional level, there are certain books which are continually on demand, such as the Synaxarium, the Synodos, and the Miracles of the Virgin Mary. There are books which every church and monastery, these are the books which every church and monastery should have. The books are very important for 2 reasons. One, their monumentality represents the richness and the power of the community, as well as its devotion and loyalty to the religious faith. Second, the one who donates it feels entitled to ask for a particular intercession in favor of the monastery, so the manuscript displays patronage of the monastic community and attests to its ideological identity. During the 12th century, written culture was affected by traumatic events with a consequent loss of the core corpora of texts. Besides material factors, this was probably due to the change in linguistic standards. That is, translated texts have become virtually unintelligible even to the clergy. The combined effects of linguistic change on the one hand and post-decline in literary culture and the long textual transmission by copying on the other led to extensive textual corruption. In consequence, ancient Aksumite translations were either superficially revised or transformed by complex and unexpected processes. The central role in the production of manuscripts was played by the monastic communities, and monasteries have also been, and in many cases still are, the main repositories. Manuscripts are rarely preserved in special devices, places, Usually they are considered precious objects and are inventoried and preserved in the same place as liturgical objects. As far as transmission is concerned, Ethiopic manuscripts reveal substantially mechanical textual traditions. This strongly clashes with both the purported predominance of orality in Africa and as an assumed consequence, copists' arbitrariness in transmitting texts. One of the ways in which the books were transmitted is through copying by the students of the traditional church schools. These students usually go to well-known monasteries looking for the best places to learn. When they return to their home monastery, the students bring books copied by themselves. Monastic leaders also play a very important role in circulating books since they travel to so many religious places for learning, evangelizing, and teaching processes. Ethiopian emperors who lived from 13th century to 17th century have also been credited with forming libraries in their palaces. They usually organize groups who are called Kahanate Deptera to take the responsibility of copying and circulating manuscript books. Some emperors are also known in buying books from the Middle Eastern countries and donating it to the most popular monasteries. In the 15th century, the 15th century has long been seen as a bridge connecting periods, the medieval and the early modern continents, as European exploration opened up Africa and the New World. This is particularly true of Ethiopia, which converted to Christianity, soon developed on elaborate monastic system complete with scriptorians and began to send delegations to European nations in the 1400s, where it had a strong impact on the European history by appearing in force at the Council of Florence. There they claimed that Prester John, often heard but never seen, was in their land and eager for contact with Europe. So 15th century is a literature of contact, whether documenting the Highland states' constant warfare with the medieval multi-ethnic Islamic states of its eastern border, of Ethiopia's increasing interaction with European military and religious groups. Perhaps owing to this increased contact with multiple states, Ethiopia began a period of rising literary production in the 14th century with poetry, hagiographies, and historical chronicles proliferating. Although 17th century Ethiopia tends to garner more attention from scholars due to the Jesuit presence in Ethiopia, it cannot properly be understood without understanding its gestation in the military and cultural conflicts of the 15th century, as well as its literary and religious transformations. The towering figure of the 15th century Ethiopia is Emperor Zarayakob, who ruled for almost 4 decades during many female saints and martyrs' lifetime from 1434 to 1469. He was a powerful military leader who instituted a mountain prison for all male heirs in recent monarchs, an innovation, as scholars say, that entered Milton's Paradise Lost and informed Samuel Johnson's Rasselas. He was also an important religious and literary figure due to his role in reforming the church and solidifying Ethiopia's reverence of the Virgin Mary. The emperor's disagreement with some religious sects like the Stephanites during that time made him even more eager to circulate books, especially books which put emphasis on the Virgin Mary, since the Stephanites were against with the idea of worshipping her. Zarayakob galvanized the cult of Mary in Ethiopia by sponsoring in the 1440s the translation from Arabic of a number of folk tales about the Virgin Mary, some of which originated in Europe. It became the vast compendium known as Amber Maya, or the Miracles of Mary. Emperor Zarayakob had a special place to the Virgin Mary. He wrote several books and translated a number of miracle stories books about her from different languages. Zarayakob's contribution towards the circulation of books is enormous. His his attempts to Ethiopianize religious books by putting his own interpretations made the literature grow from being only translation. He wrote many original works in praise of Virgin Mary and translated Arabic Christian texts, particularly Egyptian hagiographies of the early church fathers, expanding literary boundaries. The stories of foreign female saints like Saint Arsima, Saint Mary of Egypt, Saint Tribita, and Saint Barbara arose in this fertile context. Although these texts are hagiographies and therefore not a scientific accounting of bibliographical facts, they contain historical information not found elsewhere about the progression of disease like the bubonic plague, the rise of new cities, the development of travel routes among regions, books even brought from different countries, and the ownership and treatment of the slaves. Today, these saints are Ethiopia's most popular female saints, and thousands attend their annual festival. These female saints are the earliest foreign women known in Ethiopic hagiographies. Even though their hagiographies were not documented separately, we find them in very popular books like the Miracles of the Virgin Mary, the Argamon, which is the hymns of Mary, written by Amador. To my knowledge, no account which is written for a woman has been translated in manuscript book form until the 19th century. However, there are evidences which show that the influence of these women since the 14th century. These hagiographies of female saints were so deeply rooted in the people's minds that they were mentioned by most of early local female saint stories that lived in different parts of Ethiopia. Today, they almost lost their foreign identity among the believers of Ethiopian Orthodox Church. In most cases, the influence was very deep, that the local female saints lived and died in the same way as these foreign saints. Some religious sects within the Orthodox Christians also used their stories as instruments in order to achieve their own political and religious missions. The story of Arsema was a part of the corpus of exempla used by traveling preachers and was actually incorporated into several preachers' sermons for the Feast of the Purification. The hagiography's immense popularity and broad dissemination suggests that the book had a complex history of its own. The legend of Arsema and Armenia is particularly relevant to us wishing to understand the medieval mentality concerning women, specifically with regard to martyrdom, spirituality, and monasticism. This combination of popularity and attention to women and women's issues makes the hagiography especially receptive to feminist and cultural critical approach that aim to bring to the surface particular assumptions embedded in the text and to examine how they are strongly gendered in the decidedly patriarchal culture of the Middle Ages. The hagiography makes us to consider it as a phenomenon whose pattern emerges from its many occurrences across time and space. The image also suggests the widespread diffusion and the interconnectedness of the tales stretching across Ethiopia. Most of the female saints who traveled fairly extensively and made pilgrimage to many places worked largely in the conversion of pagans and in establishing monasteries. We can sketch out the cultural and historical landscape, and we can understand the anxieties and suspicions surrounding women under monasticism mounted in the medieval period, at least in response to the tension between the dramatic increase in women's interest in a celibate monastic life and the dwindling options available to them for satisfying that interest. So these female saints were nuns dedicated to extreme asceticism who dominated important monastic communities in the ancient Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Through their hagiographies, we get a better understanding of how medieval Ethiopian texts represent gender roles and theology, enabling us to complicate our understanding of Christian texts in general. They are not sentimental figures. They are not women who nurtures through affectionate kindness and sweet indulgence, but fierce and pitiless adversary who disciplines everyone around them. Further, their hagiography aids scholars of Africa's religious, literary, and social history by providing a clearer view of the mystical streak in African Christianity and its association with women saints. The distinctive views of the human body among those churches that rejected the Council of Chalcedon's stance on the dual nature of Christ, the development of the forms and various parts of the Ethiopian hagiography, including its poems praising saints from head to toe, and of the historical change of the world, including medicinal responses to disease, racial views of slaves, trade relations with Muslims, increased pilgrimage, and the rise of towns near monastic centers. Their hagiography, I think, is an extensive look into the mind of the medieval Ethiopian with colorful stories focus on of women's lives and an unusual generic structure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker, I don't know if you just want to switch. Yeah, just switch. So our next speaker is Alia Ibrahim. She is a doctoral candidate in Islamic art history at the University of Edinburgh. Her research interests lie in the art history of the Islamic lands, more specifically the art of the book. The focus of her current PhD dissertation is on Qurans and their transformations between the 4th/10th century and the 6th/12th centuries. She completed her MA in History of Art and Archaeology at the School of Oriental and African Studies in 2011. She has been a graphic designer with an interest in the visual culture of the region. She has also taught design, visual culture, and arts calligraphy courses. Please welcome.
This paper is the beginning of a larger research project. Can you hear me? So it's the beginning of a larger research project that I'd like to undertake in the near future. I work on the Quran. I work on the Quran from an art historical perspective, centered on the study of the visual elements that form the manuscript, which means that I create typologies of scripts and illumination and try to identify styles, trends, and visual languages, while contextualizing the Quran in its historical context, thinking of its role and use at the time of its production. I've come to realize that where my work is situated, parts of the fields of art history and Quranic studies, often disregards the biography of the manuscript. The life of the manuscript, the time in between its production and its presentation today. And this is a largely ignored subject in the literature. The institution in which the Quran is situated, be it a museum, an auction, a library, or part of diplomatic relations, is an important aspect of the manuscript studies, adding layers of meanings to it and shaping people's understanding of it. The mobility of the manuscript from its time of production until today transforms it into a palimpsest of social, religious, and political meanings. And this is what I would like to trace today in one Quran. Questions pertaining to the circulation of manuscripts, how users interact with them, the way people perceive them and use them, whether at their time of production, during their lifetime, or in the modern age. How were their statuses transformed? How did mechanical reproduction affect their role, not only as support for recitation, but also as objects? These are the issues and questions that frame my paper today. I will particularly focus on a Quran that was commissioned by a Ghaznavid Sultan in the 11th century in Khorasan, and its travel westward to Turkey, where it is kept today, uncovering the various layers of meanings it gained, transforming it from a pious object that reflected a radiant dynastic image to a political tool and a commodity for the appreciation of the connoisseur. So the Quran. The 8th volume of the Quran is now at the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul. Here we're looking at its colophon. Maybe we can turn off the lights a little bit from the side of the screen. So we're looking at its colophon here, which states that it was commissioned by the Ghaznavi Turkish Sultan Ibrahim ibn Mas'ud, who ruled between 1059 and 10... Yeah, sorry, yes. Yeah, thanks. So it was commissioned by the Ghaznavi Turkish Sultan Ibrahim ibn Mas'ud, who ruled between 1059 and 1099. It's a multi-volume Quran with Persian tafsir, authored by the Quranic scholar al-Haddadi, who died in the first decade of the 11th century. It's the earliest dated copy known to us with a Persian translation and commentary accompanying the Quranic text. On the verso of this double page is a crown-like device inscribed with the name of its copyist and the date of its completion. كتبه ولحقه العبد عثمان بن الحسين الرجال الغزنوي في شهور سنة 84 و400, copied and illuminated by the servant Uthman al-Warraq al-Ghaznawi during the month of the year 484 to 91. The place of production of the Quran is not mentioned in the manuscript, but its visual language places it securely within a group of imperial Ghaznavid Qurans, which are dispersed among various collections in the world, from Mashhad to Paris. The Quran was probably produced at the court in Ghazna, the capital of the Ghaznavid dynasty, which ruled between the end of the 10th century and the second half of the 12th century, over a vast territory that included the eastern Iranian lands, mainly Khorasan, and this is a map here, which is now West Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and eastern Iran, and also northwestern India. The Ghaznavid maintained close relations with the Abbasids, presenting themselves as the defenders of Sunni orthodoxy in the east. They took the legitimacy for their succession to the throne from the Abbasid Caliphate, even though geographical contacts between Iraq and eastern Iran became minimal. The Ghaznavid sultans built an empire with a radiant image to impress the rest of the Eastern Islamic world. The rich architectural program that the sultans adopted attests to that. Artists and artisans migrated from west of Khorasan and from the east, shaping a rich, eclectic local building style. Men of letters were hired for the court, scientists and the finest Persian poets were recruited to write and recite panegyric poems, transforming Gaza into a great center of culture. Ghazna, sorry. Moreover, the celebrations at the court and the opulent interior and furnishings of the palaces, which were described by the historian Bayhaqi, inform us about the luxurious life that the Ghaznavid sultans lived. It was through their patronage of the arts that the Ghaznavid rulers aimed at communicating a powerful and rich image of their empire. The Quran of Sultan Ibrahim fulfills this purpose with its monumental feel, abundant use of gold, and remarkable craftsmanship. The Quran measures 34 by 24.5 centimeters, a little bit bigger than an A4 size. It employs 4 different scripts. Its exquisite illumination and the artistry involved in its layout point to an art piece that definitely stood out at the time of its production. The frontispiece was built meticulously, and which we will come back to at the end of the presentation. The travels of the Quran. So the biography of the manuscript, the history of its travel from the Ghaznavid court to the Topkapi Palace of the Ottoman Sultan is largely unknown. However, signs appear on the pages of the manuscript, marking its travel and unfolding stories about how people perceived it and interacted with it. A waqf sign appears at the top of this spread. You can see it in white, indicates that the Quran was once endowed to a mosque or madrasa, signaling a change in its status from an expensive commission that complemented the luxurious lifestyle to a charitable gift that was used for different purposes in a specific point in time. The fact that the Quran has Persian tafsir indicates that it might have been used for educational purposes by Persian speakers in a madrasa or a mosque. Additional traces that I found in the manuscript unfold its transformation and the ways in which people perceived it and interacted with it. For example, a later hand had gone through the whole manuscript, smudging the names of several early companions of the Prophet. So here you can see the smudging of Abu Huraira, the smudging of Abu Bakr, and that of Uthman, two instances here. The smudging of the names of Abu Huraira, Abu Bakr, and Uthman might be a reflection of the practice of cursing the early companions of the Sahaba. This indicates a leader with Shiite sympathies and suggests that at some point during its journey west, the manuscript passed through an area and period with a large Shiite population, such as Safavid Iran. Moreover, the name of the copyist was altered from Uthman to Ali, as you can see here in the column. These signs tell us about how people perceived, used, and interacted with the Quran, not only as a holy text, but also as an object, appropriating it at times. This is only one of the many layers of meanings that the manuscript gained through its process of circulation. In other words, the manuscript reflects the different environments in which it was used through its travel, from its original place of production to its final destination. The Quran as a diplomatic gift. On February 2nd, 2012, the director of the Topkapı Museum, Dr. Ilber Otaylı, and the Turkish ambassador to Tehran, Umut Yardım, joined an orchestrated ceremony to offer a facsimile edition of this 8th volume to the library of the Islamic Consultative Assembly, Majlis Shura al-Islami in Tehran. It was the first time that Topkapı offers a manuscript to Iran's Majlis library. The ceremony before Parliament was widely publicized in Turkish and Iranian media. Leading politicians, religious scholars, and academics attended the occasion. As reported in the press, the timing of the ceremony was intentionally designed to fall on 12 Rabi' al-Awwal, the traditional date for the celebration of the birth of the Prophet, Mawlid al-Nabawi. The gift carried with it, obviously, both political and religious significance. Two themes were foregrounded in the ceremony, namely the sacred art of Quranic calligraphy and the early practice of translating the Quran into Persian. But when the Iranian Speaker of Parliament, Ali Larijani, addressed the assembly, he described the Quran as a force capable of drawing together Muslims separated by sectarian differences. This statement reflected the political act that aimed at symbolically bringing together the Sunni of Turkey and the Shia of Iran behind the Ghaznavid Quran of Sultan Ali. Hence, the Quran was transformed from being a mirror of the Ghaznavid power to a symbolic gift from the Turkish modern state to the Iranian opponent. The aim is to position the Turkish state as a political and cultural power in the region that is capable of uniting the Ummah behind it. I'd like to mention a similar diplomatic exchange as an example of how mobility of manuscripts alters our perception of Qurans. The event happened 3 years ago, 3 years actually after the episode of Sultan Ibrahim's Quran. On the 23rd of November 2015, the Russian President Vladimir Putin offered a copy of the oldest kept Quran in Russia to the Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. The Quran is known in the literature as Uthman's Quran, the third Caliph's Quran, which supposedly bears his blood. But based on paleographic analysis and on carbon dating, the Quran was probably copied in the second half of the 8th century. And we don't know whether it was produced in Umayyad or Abbasid times. Nevertheless, the Quran is perceived as one of the oldest early authentic copy of the Quran, compiled 20 years after the Prophet's death. And this is how the Russian media talked about it, emphasizing that it was copied in the 7th century. Whether this is true or not becomes secondary to people's perception of it, which transformed the manuscript into almost a relic through time, adding a religious symbolic meaning to it. according to Islamic tradition, responsible for the codification of the Quranic text, and hence the symbolic value of this copy as a tool of unification, offered from Putin to Khamenei. The visit was planned to discuss the Assad regime, and the meeting was relatively small in comparison to the previous one, but was heavily publicized by Russian media. Putin said during the meeting, "No one can or should force any form of government on the Syrian people from the outside, or decide who could rule them. This would be decided only by the Syrian people." So we have a meeting here between Putin and Khamenei discussing Syria with an authoritative copy of the Quran at the center. The Quran becomes a tool through which the Russian state is legitimizing the Syrian regime by offering Khamenei a copy of Othman's Quran. It's interesting that these gifts were actually facsimiles, as copies of original manuscripts. Neither the Turkish nor the Russian gifts were authentic. They are mechanically reproduced copies of the original Quran, which no longer retain their authenticity. The manuscript loses some of the marks on its pages through the process of reproduction. It loses the signs that allow one to retell its story, its biography. In other words, denying access to the history of the manuscript. And it's not by coincidence that the Turkish state offered a copy and not the original Quran to the Iranian state. By doing so, its authority is preserved. It's preserved in its original form in the Ottoman Tomb of the Palace. The same thing could be said on the Russian gift, which serves to position Russia as a dominant political power. The act of offering Qurans as gifts between states or courts or dynasties has been a public form of communication in Islamic history. I'll show you this Ottoman painting here depicts a well-documented event in which an envoy was sent with gifts from the Safavid to the Ottoman court. Here we have the Safavid ambassador, Shah Uri, born before Sultan Selim, here. Before Sultan Selim II, sorry, and on his right and left stand Ottoman officials. Behind him are members of the Safavid embassy who are wearing robes of honor offered by the Ottoman Sultan. In the foreground, at the bottom, Ottoman Janissaries hold the gifts. In order of importance, these are a single volume manuscript, presumably the Quran, followed by 2 volumes of acceptable books, and this is how the accompanying text mentions them. Then gold boxes and probably some forms of textile and carpets. Such items are generally listed in contemporaneous sources with the Quran, always gaining primacy. In one contemporaneous account, the Quran depicted here is said to have been copied by the 3rd Caliph, Ali. Othman, sorry. And the second is the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, which highlights a long-standing lineage of Iranian kingship. Hence, this painting communicates the power play between the Ottoman and the Safavids, while the Ottoman painting depicts the Iranians wearing the robes of honor and the ambassador going in front of the Ottoman Sultan, as paying tribute to them in a relation of power. The Safavids, on the other hand, given that the first manuscript is the Quran copied by Ali, and the second is the Shahnameh, were aiming at asserting their legitimacy in front of the Ottomans. So it is the 4th Caliph and it's Ali, not Othman. Similarly, the act of offering Sultan Brahim's Quran from Turkey to Iran symbolizes the power play between the 2 states, especially that Ali Larijani's comments emphasize the idea of uniting the Ummah behind the Quran, which has now returned to Iran. So to go back to the Quran of Sultan Brahim, and in addition to the political layer that was added to the manuscript through its mobility, the Quran became, through its dispersion, a commodity. And this is another channel through which mobility actually affects the meaning of manuscripts. It's the economic or commercial channel, namely the art market. 2 weeks ago, a double-sided illuminated folio appeared in Sotheby's, the Art of the Islamic World auction sale on 20th of April 2016, that had been taken out of Sultan Brahim's Quran. Its size and design, which is identical to the right-hand page of the surviving volume, from the Istanbul Topkapı Museum, leaves no doubt that it was part of the volume's frontispiece. Here, the left-hand page is from the 8th volume, and the right-hand page is the verso of the Sotheby's volume, completing the design of the 8th volume frontispiece. In addition, at each of the 4 corners, an 8-pointed star is inscribed with the reading from right to left, top to bottom. ذهبه محمد بن عثمان, I don't know if you can read this, it's a little bit unclear. ذهبه محمد بن عثمان بن الحسين الوراق الغزنوي غفر الله له, eliminated by Muhammad bin Uthman bin al-Hussein al-Warraq al-Ghazna, may God forgive him. Completing the picture that the Quran was eliminated by the copyist Uthman's son Muhammad. The folio that appeared at the auctions was estimated between 4,000 and 6,000 pounds. It was sold for 24,000 pounds. The seller or buyer must have known that the folio is part of the Quran, and at the end actually 2 people were bidding in competition to get it. Hence, it was after the dispersion of the manuscript and the political meaning it gained as part of the power play between the Turkish and Iranian state that a monetary value was given to one of its folios in the art market. The emergence of this folio as a commodity transforms once again people's perception of it and shapes our understanding of Quran's palimpsest of social, political, and religious meanings. To conclude, these layers of meanings, which I have attempted to uncover through the mobility of one Quranic manuscript, inform us about the role of the Quran and the ways in which it was used and perceived, whether in history, during its travels, or today. It's by looking at signs of mobility in manuscripts that we learn about the ways in which people perceived them, used them, interacted with them, or appropriated them for different purposes, providing them with symbolic meanings, transforming them into political tools of power or mirrors of glamorous dynasties. In addition, the Quran was also an educational tool, an amulet, a protective talisman, and only a few of its symbolic meanings which can be highlighted by examining its mobility that leaves signs on its pages. These important aspects of the Quran are largely disregarded in both textual and visual analysis of manuscripts, but that are nevertheless essential to our understanding of books in general and their role in Islamic cultures across time and geographic boundaries. The mobility of the Quran, its afterlife, should be part of narrating its story, a story that shapes our understanding of it today. Thank you.
Our next presentation is by Mohammed from EUB. He is professor in the Civilization Program at the Department of Arabic and Near Eastern Languages at AUB. He is the director of the Center of Arts and Humanities, the Mellon Grant at AUB, which is filled with lovely and intelligent faculty and fellows. I say that because I am one of the fellows. His areas of research are the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, Arabic narratology, early and modern, the Arabian Nights, literature of Islamic Spain, Al-Andalus, early Zaidi history, and dogmas. The title of his paper is The Arabian Nights of Layla wa Layla, a case study in travel and perception. Please thank me. Please thank me. Please welcome me. Please join me in welcoming
apologize for not being able to attend yesterday. No, I won't be able to attend afterwards due to health problems. Sorry. My talk is divided into 3 sections, actually. Section 1 is a swift literary history, kind of old cheese, old bread, of the 1001 Nights as a book in mobility. Sections 2 and 3 are a case study in reception, based on the engagement of Badr Adib, died 2005, with the cycle of Hasib Karimuddin and the Serpent. Section 2 addresses the philosophical system that lies at the heart of Adib's enterprise, and Section 3 studies his narrative, Adib's narrative strategies, and compares his attempt to that of Pierre Menard. Edward Said argues in his essay, Traveling Theory, I'm quoting, that ideas and theories travel. Culture and intellectual life are usually nourished and often sustained by this circulation of ideas. And whether it takes the form of acknowledged or unconscious influence, creative borrowing, or wholesale appropriation, the movement of ideas and the theories from one place to another is a useful, enabling condition of intellectual activity. And books, the carriers of ideas, imagination, and theories, travel and migrate, they circulate, break through borders and thresholds, are translated, abridged, rewritten, and they also form new circuits of intertextual wealth. They adapt to new perspectives and changes in meaning and are, moreover, even readable. Such cultural symbiosis has always been facilitated by the exchange networks of trading goods by way of migrants and through translations, just to name to specify 3 ways. Perhaps no profane book other than 1001 Nights has traveled so extensively through cultures and centuries. And as Jorge Luis Borges puts it, centuries, quote, pass away and people are still listening to the voice of travel. The ostensible history of the Nights has been the subject of interest and meticulous studies since the 10th centuries of the Common Era. In what follows, I'll be giving a swift sketch, referring only to the most significant moments in the history of the reception and ongoing transformation of the Nights. Nabia Abbott has shown that the earliest portion known to us in an early 9th is an early 9th fragment of the 1001 Nights, dated in 879. The earliest mention of the book of the Nights goes back to the first half of the 10th century, as the famed story was known to Arab scholars in Baghdad as the Hizar Ifsani, or 1,000 Tales, of sensitive origin that reveals an apparent relation to the Indo-Persian royal house of the Sassanids between 224 and 651 of our Common Era. From the point of view, this is the fragment that Nabia Abbott relied on. From the point of its literary history, the enduring metamorphosis of the text of the Nights, which discloses a complex and oral and written process, becomes difficult to trace. Like a magnet, the famed story had attracted tales, themes, and motifs from both high and popular literatures, going back to various cultural spheres. It had been repeatedly supplemented and modified and underwent rearrangements and adaptations of individual stories. And I think I'm using the wrong, the older, that's fine. It's also important to bear in mind that the reception of the text in word literature must be understood to have taken place not as a single event, but rather as a continuous process running through the 18th century and reaching a kind of climax in the Romantic period. The renewed interest in the Knights in the Arab world as of the 19th century can be partially read in the light of this process. In other words, ironically, the Arabian Nights returned to its source of origin as one of Europe's cultural exports to what would ultimately be considered as the Third World. The cycle of Hasib Karimuddin and the Queen of Serpents, whose adaptation as a hypertext in the work of the contemporary Egyptian writer Badruddin is the focus of my talk, appears in most of the Arabic editions of the Nights and belongs to what we call the Egyptian, or what Professor Mahdi called the Egyptian branch. This cycle traces themes and motifs that infiltrated in the text from various ancient cultures. Just to give you an idea of the various tradition sources of the hypertext or the hypertext of Hasib Karimuddin. Now I move to section 2, where I will discuss Badruddin's إعادة حكاية حاسب كريم الدين. A reading of Badruddin's 1926, died 2005, إعادة حكاية حاسب كريم الدين وملكة الحياة، subtitle وراء الكينونة الكتاب الثاني، Cairo 1990, reveals the unrestrained option of the imagination of contemporary writers whose rewriting of the cycle amounts to a diegetic transposition. The book, as its subtitle discloses, is the second part of a literary project titled by the author as Beyond Being, وراء الكينونة. This is إعادة حاسب كريم الدين, the second volume, and here we have the first volume, which has nothing to do with the second volume, by the way. But both books run under the title of subtitle وراء الكينونة, Beyond Being. The first part of the project appeared also in the same year, 1990. It is, however, a thin volume of prose poetry with the title of أقسام وعزائم, oaths and incantations. One wonders, or at least I wondered, about the possible overarching theme that brings these two books as consecutive essays carrying the same subtitle. A kind of swift explanation is attempted by the author in the introduction to Book 1. His account, however, does not make our endeavor towards understanding easy. Though, in this book, he refers to still a third book of his, which was written a year earlier, in 1989, titled The Impossible and Value, an Experiment in Dialectics. The title refers to a sort of philosophical endeavor, as both words value and dialectic belong to the semantic field of philosophical discourse. In أقسام وعزائم, Adib explains, I'm quoting, the first part was an employment of love and art, quo, oaths and incantations, as they are used by a sorcerer in order to bring forth and to summon beings, kainuna. The sorcerers call for both states, ahwal, and manifestations, tajalliyat, which are facets of being. Being that, despite its integrity, remains mixed with time and threatened into vanishing. Lastly, he summons entities, kayanat, from the realm of collective unconsciousness that tries to capture the ultimate value of existence, i.e., to become mere being. However, it collapses in the realm of exemplum, umthula, or myth. Hence, being will remain withdrawn from the sorcerer and remains ambiguous to him. And now, to try to make sense of this, to my mind, confused paragraph, let us turn our attention to the vocabulary employed by the author. The three key terms are being, al-kaynuna, the impossible, al-mustahil, and value, al-qima in Arabic. First, al-kaynuna. It is a term used by the mystic Ibn al-Arabi to refer to God's external being. The cloud, al-ama, is the first existential condition, dharf, that supported God's external being, kaynunat al-haq, while at the same time identifying it with absolute being, al-khayal al-mutlaq. This cloud is otherwise known as the absolute imagination, where divine breathing and nafas al-Rahmani is an act of imagination. Now, one of the commentators of Ibn al-Arabi, Abdul Ghani al-Nabulusi, elucidates that, I'm quoting, it is in this cloud, al-Ama, which represents the first external being of God, that all things, corporeal and intelligible or comprehensible, have been determined, ta'yeen. It is in the fifth sphere, da'ira, of God's external being that things become manifest, zuhur, through the verb be, kun, uttered by the divine breath, and through it things become existent, mawjood, as manifestations of God's kaynuna. Now this is the cosmological system of Ibn Arabi, the five spheres, the wa'ir of being. My interest is basically in the kaynuna and mawara al-kaynuna. In Arabic thought, the term wujud, terms wujud and an-niyya are usually used to refer to the terms existence or being in English and other languages. Same applies to modern Arab thought. I'm omitting many parts now of my research, just mentioning what is of interest for us now in the talk. It is noteworthy, however, that Sayyid Qutb writes in 1962 of al-kaynuna al-insaniya, referring, now not anymore in Arabic, I think the term is taken from Ibn Arabi, Ibn al-Arabi, but he's referring to the restricted nature of the human existence, which is bounded by the limits of space and time. It is not my intention today to survey the evolution of the term kaynuna in Arabic philosophical thought and its semantic meanings by the various thinkers, but rather to try to be able to understand the meaning of the term as employed by Adib in his books. To my mind, Adib relies on Ibn al-Arabi's cosmological vision of the universe and its various spherical levels and the divine breath that bestows the various manifestations of being through the creative verb to be, kun, the Quranic verb, kun. Ibn al-Arabi corroborates that the human existence is dependent on the external being of God. I'm quoting, فَأَيْنَمَا كُنَّا كَانَ الْحَقُّ مَعَنَا كَيْنُونَةً وُجُودِيَّةً مُنَزَّهَةً كَمَا يَلِيقُ بِهِ وَكُنَّا أَمْرٌ وُجُودِيٌّ فَالْبَاطِلُ عَدَمٌ وَالْحَقُّ وُجُودٌ. Now we move to the second term, al-mustahil, by Adib. Adib defines al-mustahil as the impossible, or the impossible as an ever-transmuting reality and equates it with being, which is in permanent flux. He argues, I'm quoting, although the impossible or ever-transmuting is raw material not possessed yet, it is, however, value that makes of it an eternal and fixed quiddity, jawhar, fabric, which surpasses time and space. Let's move to the third term before I try to bring the three terms together. Adib argues, I'm quoting, the quest in search for what lies beyond being, wara al-kaynuna, which should end by discovering the self, leads to explicating the value of the differentiation made in the 1001 Nights between quality, sifa, and craft or trade, sana. For the human being exists through quality, but fulfills her existence through craft. To strive towards only one of them, disregarding the other, is obtrusive it does not generate value. End of quote. I will try to sum up my understanding, my own understanding of Adib's somewhat confused reflections. It goes as follows. Human existence, kainuna, is a state of exile and the idiosyncrasy of time and space. This existence will lose all meaning if it is devoid of value. Things, accordingly, have to exist in relations with value. Value, however, is prior to being. It belongs, so to speak, to another, a higher being, kainuna mutlaqa. To realize value, the human being should strive, not only through will, but through a combination of quality and craft. The quality is signified by love, which urges the human being to go on a mystic journey in search for the sifa. So the craft, the san'a, urges towards a journey to the sifa, which is the sifa of Prophet Muhammad or Haqiqa Muhammadiyya. As for the san'a, it denotes to a trait, a vocation in life, in which one should excel. Excelling in one's trade gives the human being a sense of value in the day-to-day affairs of life, here in space and time. Whereas the ultimate value and meaning can only be realized beyond being, al-kaynuna, in the realm of what Ibn al-Arabi labels as the kaynuna amma over all beings. What are Adib's pertinent sources in his approach to value and the human existence? Ibn Arabi is definitely a major source of inspiration, as we have just seen. But if one tries to designate a modern source, one finds him embracing different nuances from the axiological system of the American philosopher Wilbur Marshall Urban, 1873 to 1950. Urban intended to formulate a general theory of value within the limits of psychology and phenomenology. In his second book, Intelligible World, Metaphysics and Value, Urban describes it as a dialectical inquiry. Since dialectic in historical sense has always been concerned with issues of valuation. Now, Urban adds, I'm quoting, dialectic, says Bergson, is necessary to put intuition to the proof. Necessary also that intuition should break itself up into concepts, and so be propagated to other men. But all it does, often enough, is to develop the result of that intuition that transcends it. Urban asserts further that, I'm quoting, faith is based on the dialectical analysis of the concept of the moral end. The task of the philosopher is that of making transparent, as it were, the a priori structure of value and being in the necessary relations. Now, Urban's philosophy belongs to the Platonic tradition, which exalts the good above being and knowing. So it is wara al-kaynuna. Good is something found beyond our existence here and the here and now. We can discover many similarities and affinities between Adib's approach to value and human existence and the theory of Urban. A fact that makes me suggest that he might have been familiar with Urban axiology. Urban was first introduced in Egypt by Zaki Naguib Mahmoud in 1956. We need to keep in mind, however, that Badr Adib graduated from the University of Cairo in 1946 with a BA in philosophy. He also studied aesthetics at the Sorbonne. As such, he might have been introduced to the axiological philosophy of Urban through many possible channels and now reached section 3 of my book. Adib's book starts with a 2-page introductory note. A first-person narrator addresses the reader, setting the time and the state of affairs. I'm quoting. In these strange times of ours, Arab countries, Arab countries, there appears a growing and mounting wave of writing memoirs. We used to think that it was restricted to Egypt directly after the abatement of the lives of Abdel Nasser, but it seems, however, to be a mark of our age. In the second paragraph, the narrating I reveals himself as Hasib Karim-ud-Din. I am Hasib Karim-ud-Din, says he. Hasib refers to his story in the Nights. He corrects what had been written about him in the Nights and about his family and origin, but he makes no mention of Shahrazad. Toward the end of a 2-page prologue, a concluding prose poem questions being, creation, and the world. Hence, the reader realizes that she will be faced with an ontological text, grappling with the whimsical nature of existence. Badruddin keeps the Hasib of, I'm using the old thing, it's fine. Badruddin keeps the, would you kindly help me? Just to change the slideshow, I think it's like this, and now I go back to let me go back to the darkness. Badruddin keeps the cycle of Hasib intact, almost intact, summing up long descriptions or undertaking various abridgments and adding commentary sentences at crucial junctures. So he puts in front of himself the Hikayat Hasib Karim-ud-Din and the Arabian Nights word by word and just interferes here and there, adding sentences, junctures. Now, the prologue is different and the prose poem is different, and then it is fast, intact, almost. Adib's rewriting approaches Hasib tale as a Sufi hagiography, an esoteric rite of passage, leading towards spiritual union with the prototype of the perfect man, the idea of al-Haqiqa al-Muhammadiyya. In undertaking this goal, Adib remains faithful to the text of the text, where Bulukia inherits from his father, a Jewish sage from Cairo, an ebony chest in which he finds the description and qualities, sifa, of Prophet Muhammad, who would be sent by God in the latter days and be the Lord of all humanity. His heart becomes captivated with love of Muhammad, and he goes wandering over the earth, hoping to foregather with him. Now, part 2 of section 3, rewriting between Pierre Binard and Badr Adib. In Borges's Pierre Binard, author of the Quixote, the narrator is a critic, commenting on the work of an imaginary author who attempted to rewrite Cervantes' Don Quixote. Menard's Quixote, although fragmentary and unfinished, is a verbatim reproduction of some chapters of the original. The narrator, however, judges Menard's Quixote as, I'm quoting, arguably more subtle and infinitely richer. This is an extraordinary and insinuating experiment that oscillates between pastiche and parody and questions the very meaning of literature. This innovative text by Borges has been the subject of many interpretations. I'm quoting, in writing a rigorously literal Don Quixote from his own inspiration, argues Jeanette, Menard allegorizes the act of reading considered as or disguised into an act of writing. They mesh into a unifying metaphor of the complex and ambiguous relationship between writing and reading. Now, in our case, in the case of Badruddin's rewriting the cycle of Hasib Karim-ud-Din, the strategy is ingenuously different than that of Menard. Although the narrating I is ultimately fictitious, the narrator in Adib's case reports the telling of his own story, which was already written and narrated for centuries in the Thousand and One Nights. Contrary to the narrator by Borges, who is heterozygotic, absent from the narrated work, Hasib is both homozygotic, present, and at the same time he is autozygotic, identical with the protagonist. Another major juncture that distinguishes Hadid's endeavor lies in the fact that, contrary to Pierre Guinard, who was rewriting a narrative by a known author, Cervantes in that case, Hadid is attempting to rewrite a narrative that belongs to popular rule, a book without an author. In the case of the Nights, the text is unsettled. The Arabian Nights, the Thousand Nights, its text is unsettled. It has been endlessly reread and appropriated in different contexts. It is a tissue of quotations drawn from innumerable centers of culture. It is a multi-dimensional space in which a variety of writings, none of them original, blend and clash. In addition, the hermeneutics implicit in Hadid's rewriting can be described through the interplay between two strategies that are closely related, i.e. intertextuality and parody, or rather pastiche in our case. Yeah. In his rewriting of Hasib cycles, Hadid undertakes numerous alterations, omissions, and insinuations. These fallacities and displacements create the potential for new and unexpected meaning. As a result, Hadid's hypertext reveals a hybrid nature and a ploy to transform the original and turn it into a personal history, a vita, whose slogan grows to be the famous sentence from the chorus's ode in Oedipus the King, "Count no man heaven till he dies, free of pain at last." This verse makes the title of chapter 11 of Hadid's rewriting and is often repeated by the Queen of Serpents as a lesson of life and imagery for the instability of human fortunes. Hadid's is a meta-diegetic narrative in the sense that it becomes not only a fiction that contains another or includes reflection on its own diegesis, development, or characteristics, but moreover, a narrative of divergent and creative writing in which dialogism identifies writing as both subjectivity and communication. In his memoirs, Hasib becomes an involved listener and spectator at the same time, who identifies emotionally with the characters of his own story as narrated to him by the Serpent Queen. He indulges in an intra-diegetic form of a gaze and interacts directly with Bulukia and Janshah, whose life stories occur in front of him as if on a screen. This act amounts to a total violation of the boundaries between the levels of the narration. Hadid's rewriting is a periodic creation of new fiction through the rewriting of an old, which is at the same time itself, where parody is an exploration of difference and similarity that invites a recognition of literary codes. The text is designed around the very act of listening. The imperative verbs isma and a'lam. Like Shahrazad, the Serpent Queen turns Hasib indifference into reflective listening, a spiritual initiation through hearing. Hasib cannot but listen, and he becomes absorbed in what he hears. He is no longer a listener, but changes into a custodian of the world. In his palimpsestic hypertext, Hadid offers a novel reading, opting for an experience of constant transience and impermanence, the crossing of spaces and shifting of physical as well as imagined borders. from the central dynamic and the very structure of the myth. However, the retelling of the story reflects a powerful process of territorialization that converges towards particular erasures and consolidation. Hence, a new configurative meaning which opens up new horizons of expectation seen from our point now, contemporary point in time. Hence, a new configurative meaning which opens the expectations. Borges writes, and I'm ending, I'm quoting, to presuppose that every recombination of elements is necessarily inferior to its original is to presuppose that draft 9 is necessarily inferior to draft H, as there can only be drafts. The concept of a definitive text corresponds only to religion and fatigue. And Hassan Karimuddin traveled through the centuries, recognizing manifold differences intrinsic to time and writing. It had passed many stations and margins before it found in Adib's attempt a unique and innovative enterprise in Arabic literature. Thank you.
I think my role here is essentially to get out of the way for you to ask some interesting questions. I was going to make a few comments first, though, but we'll just go with the questions then. Yeah. Is that fine, so? Just skip to the questions. I was taking very careful notes the whole time. No, I think you've been sitting and listening for quite a while today, so I would love to hear questions from the audience. So I saw Michael's hand first.
My question's for Dr. Salam Ali. Okay, so as you were talking about Kiddush the Arsima and her importance to both the Armenian Church and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, I was remembering the story of Haile Selassie's Abba Lijoch, if you're familiar with the story, and maybe more importantly for us today, the similarities between Ethiopian Fidel and Armenian script. So my question is, was there direct textual interaction between these two churches, or was, especially in the medieval or Middle Ages, or was there always an intermediary, such as the Arab Christian churches?
Yeah, I think at this time, if I will, I'd just like to have one question at a time, just answer.
I do not think that there is a relationship between the Armenian Church and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church because the texts were translated from Arabic, especially the hagiography of Arsima, Seminary of Egypt, and Barbara was translated from Arabic from Egypt, from the Coptic. So I don't think there is a relationship between the Armenian Church and Ethiopian Orthodox Church, especially concerning this manuscript. But there are some relationships. The motives are, come here and there. If you read the Armenian hagiographies or the Greek hagiographies, and also Coptic and Ethiopic hagiographies, they all share the same motive, especially when you talk about Ethiopian, the female saints. They share motives like the concept of martyrdom, for example, is one of the common themes
reception is very different. You know, the reception, when they for example, when you talk about Ethiopic texts, they don't usually agree that a woman should be martyred. So they somehow Ethiopianize the concept of martyrdom, and they take it to sainthood, you know, leaving the act of martyrdom. So this is one example, but there are no that kind of, you know, connections.
Thank you very much.
I have a question for Anya. I was really fascinated by your talk. Could you elaborate a little bit more on, you said that of course they would never part with the originals, so the gifts that are given, that have been given throughout history are always copies, of course, of the original. Of course, this is known, of course, to the receiver, I imagine, that he or she is not being given the original, which would be, of course, immensely more expensive and valuable. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the process of copying? And my second question, how is it done? How is it performed? Is it a regular Xerox machine that they go to? I mean, I assume not. So if you could elaborate a little bit more on the technical aspect of the reproduced copy that is given as a gift. This is one question. And the other question had to do with, I was very fascinated by the whole idea of smudging. And is there a connection also between the copying and the smudging? Does the smudging become less or more apparent, or is it a totally irrelevant question on my part? Sometimes when we make copies, things become clearer or less clear. And you talked about the smudging of names by the Shia clerics of Sunni ones. So I was just wondering if I don't know if that particular thing had ever been given as a gift, and if so, once it had been copied, how did that affect the visibility or of the smudged parts that you have talked about, if there's a connection?
So just to add to this, I was also intrigued by this idea of smudging, and we have Walid's little book up in the exhibition, right? Because in Picasso that is about art vandalism. I was wondering if you had any information about how this smudging was perceived historically. Was it perceived as something, that you don't do as vandalism, or was it something, acceptable? That's one thing. And then I also wondered about, was it a common practice? Do you see that in a number of different, manuscripts, or is it something rather rare? I mean, he is also a religious text, so I think I would expect it to be, a rare thing, but I'd love to hear more about that. Thank you. Someone else?
Thank you. So the process of copying, I'm afraid, I don't know what happened. They scan the original manuscript and they print it. Of course, the technology they use changed. Now you get a really very good copy of the original manuscript. I've seen manuscripts, facsimiles, where the texts are a little bit blurred, but I've seen others that were done in the 21st century where they're very sharp and you could almost say that it's an original copy. I'm not sure about how they fake the paper. I'm not very familiar with modern and technological ways of copying an original manuscript. The smudging, your question about smudging, I'm sorry, I didn't really get
If that particular instance that you mentioned was also copied, and if it had been copied, was the smudging made less or more visible?
Copied as in
As in reproduced.
Yeah, because they scan, everything is reproduced. So the smudging is reproduced in the copy as well, yes.
So it's not made less or more visible, it's just the same, it's just facsimile.
Yes. I haven't seen the facsimile because it's but I'm sure it's, yes, it's, the idea is to get a copy of the original manuscript as close as possible to paper, the way paper looks, the way the script looks, the colors. They have a way of color correcting and but I don't think they would emphasize such things. That this would be an intervention into the authenticity of the original Quranic manuscript, but I've read that it's done in non-Quranic manuscripts. How it's perceived in a specific point in time, we don't know. I haven't come across any primary sources that discuss this. To those who smudge, there's the idea of, they want to wipe it off, and so the idea of Sayyid Sahaba, but I don't know how I don't know how those who kept the manuscript thought about these smudgings when they owned the manuscript. Yeah.
I mean, it's very interesting, I think, because it's not that they like erase it and put it on the name. Maybe yes, it's the meaning of it.
The alteration.
The other case is
Yeah.
smudging.
Yeah.
It like shows, it's like disfiguring something. It's
Yes.
not like removing something, but
Yes.
like disfiguring something.
Yes, and it's still readable as well. It's still readable. So it's as if they wanted to make it visible that they're smudging this. They're not wiping it off. Yes.
Only comment just came to my mind. In this particular case, I don't think it's not necessity smudging. This is a kind of tafsir, this kind of Shia tafsir. Someone who's reading the Quran and certain words, giving them, underline them, or adding a word to denote that this should be understood this way. This happens a lot. And when we see early Shia tafsirs that way, when it is word to word, sometimes it says, we have word to the Quran and it says, this refers to Ali, this refers to Osman, this refers to, of course that's political, if you want, indication at that time, but it doesn't mean necessarily sponging, especially sponging in the Quran, which is a totally sacred text. It is a kind of, it's not ta'wil, it's tafsir. It's, adding a word in a different color, okay, for your own manuscript, for your own book. Highlighting and bringing the whole meaning into the dimension of this person is meant by this, that person is meant by this. Could be, but not necessarily some Sahaba. I'm not sure, I didn't look at that, I didn't do the best, just to,
The smudging.
sorry for
Yeah, no,
just a question.
The smudging happens in the tafsir, not in the Quran text. So in the Persian tafsir, and so this probably brings it closer to some of the Sahaba. I'm not sure, and this is really very speculative. So I thought maybe there's a relationship of the idea of highlighting. If they're highlighting, I wouldn't say that they would smudge. They would probably draw clouds. I've seen manuscripts where you draw clouds or like a contour around some words, or some form of oval and decorated things around that. This is the practice of highlighting once after the production of the manuscript. But it could be also a different way of handling in the 11th century again. This is quite old. But again, it happens in the tafsir and not in the Quranic text. I haven't seen it in the Quranic text actually.
Thank you. Thank you all three for really fascinating papers. I enjoyed all of them. They're very different. I have a question about the miracles of the Virgin. And if you wouldn't mind using the microphone when you answer it, it would be helpful. Thank you. But so you mentioned miracles of the Virgin early in your presentation, and then you spoke specifically about the miracles in 1440s. And so I got a little confused about whether there's a tradition of the miracles of the Virgin earlier in Ethiopic Christian texts, earlier than the 1440s, or if that's the earliest. And if it is early, is there a tradition of transmission from east to west, or is it all miracles of the Virgin west to east?
Basically, this 1440s version of the Virgin Mary is not the earliest miracles of her. What I was saying was about Zar Yaakov, the Emperor Zar Yaakov, took that earlier manuscript and adopted and assimilate what he was thinking about the Virgin Mary. So he interpreted the idea of the virginity and what it means to Ethiopians and to the Christian society, and he somehow tried his own imagination what it means to be a virgin and to have so that was his imagination. I was talking about the adaptation and assimilation of his own book. Basically, the miracles of the Virgin Mary are, well, we have about 11 or 12 versions of the miracles of the Virgin Mary, starting from maybe 10th or 9th century. But his assumptions about her was very much interesting. So his version of the text is very much fascinating than the others. The other ones, the ones that were translated before, were very much, direct copy of the Arabic. The Ridasi Mariam, the Qadasi Mariam, the Arganum. These are the three different versions that were translated from Arabic. But his version of and his way of seeing that book, well, for him, basically, that book is not enough. It's not explaining more about her. So that's why he tried to invent so many folktales and try to put his own interpretations on the text. So that's not the earliest manuscript, but this is more elaborated and I think it shows our identity during that period, especially the 15th century. Yeah,
Thank you very much. Sorry, it's pretty loud. I wanted to come back to the earlier questions and then the issue of taking up on the issue of the smudging versus tafsir, and then try to link it to the larger issues that today when we talk about books, etc. Because I wanted, you said earlier that you didn't see a facsimile, yet of course you only presented us with digital remediations of the book, i.e. facsimiles. So I wondered whether you had actually had access to a physical artifact that you would consider an original. And thus pose the question, to which extent we all should think more about differentiating between the book as a physical artifact and the intellectual work that is presented as a physical artifact, and the question of a copy, which of course always has a materiality to it, which makes it an original, and then the question of autobenefits and technical reproduction of the artwork, which of course therein lies the difference between the copy and the copy, in the sense of one produced by a scribe and one produced by a Xerox machine or a scanner. Yet of course, a scanner does not produce a true copy, right? There are minimal differences as you elucidated in terms of lighting, etc. So the question would be, is the smudging, whatever it is, but take the word, is it visible in the physical original, or is it due to the act of copying and reproducing it digitally?
No, the smudging, maybe I wasn't clear at this point, the smudging is in the original copy. And it's probably had happened during the lifetime of the original manuscript. So the mechanical reproduction reproduced the smudging again. The picture I showed you are pictures from the original copy. And knowing the process, most probably this smudging stayed in the manuscript. So the question about the physical artifact versus the text, so what do you mean exactly? Sorry, so the difference between looking at the physical, the Quran as a physical object versus the Quranic text, looking at it as, what is the question exactly?
Actually, it was not a question to you, rather to us as, congregating, talking about books, to not negate the fact that on one hand we talk about artifacts, on the other hand we talk about concepts. The work, intellectual work as a concept that is of course embodied in the artifact, but not reducible to the artifact, and vice versa. And that we have to keep that in mind when we talk about copies, etc. And use the word copy quite carelessly, right? We say it's original copy, yet we make a claim that the copy itself is not original. And I think we have to be very precise in what we mean by saying copy in the context of conference on books and motion. That was basically more comment than a question.
Yeah,
the smudge thing was a very sort of renewed question I had,
Okay.
but I wanted to raise the general
I
issue.
think it's the idea of authenticity versus, the copy from the original. And I think this is what you commented on. Benjamin talks about, I think it was the aura of the manuscript, which is usually lost, according to him, during the process of reproduction. I think it's interesting because what happens during the process is, of course, an attitude to really reproduce almost original artifacts. Yeah. But I've seen a lot. Most of the manuscripts I've seen are original. Sometimes some aspects in the manuscripts, like the smell of the ink, for example, or the paper, or people who examine the manuscript before me, the tearing of the pages on the edges, or the blackening of the edges of the pages, all of these are a little bit more difficult to reproduce in a copy. So these aspects are mainly the aspects that are lost during this process. Yeah.
Just a short question about the Ghaznavid Quran. And I think the manuscript was at some point in Iran, and probably in Tabriz. Then, the Tabriz was captured by the Ottomans. And many of the manuscripts were basically stolen by Ottomans, or confiscated, whatever you can call it. And then considered as a war booties to be shipped to Istanbul. So I don't think, okay, you can call it as a gift exchange from the point of the Ottomans, but from the point of the Iranians, it's definitely stolen, or maybe a war booty. So would you consider this, the ideas of war booty, for instance, or stolen or stealing? It's not a good idea, but it's a tricky thing in terms of the Oriental manuscripts, originally produced in Iran or that part of the Iranian world. Now we find many of these in Istanbul, and also Russia. It is the same thing, actually. Many of the Persian manuscripts were stolen by the Russians, again as a war booty. So to me, it's very funny what the Putin is doing. It is actually, they just try to justify what they did. They have so many treasures, from Iran, now in St. Petersburg or Istanbul. So I really like the idea of emphasizing the gift exchange, but there's also another way to consider why the exchange happened. So I think I really like your the subject. It's very interesting, especially linking to the 21st century. It's very, very interesting. But thinking about 16th century Iran is always very important to understand this very complex relationship between the Ottoman Empire and Safavid Empire. Thank you.
I think you confused two points here. There's the manuscript that's the original copy of the manuscript that's now at the Topkapi Private Museum, which was offered a couple of years ago as a copy to to Iran. And this is
original is in Iran.
no, the original is in Turkey, in Istanbul. Yes, in the Topkapi, and its facsimile was offered to Iran in a ceremony in front of the parliament. The Putin thing is a completely different manuscript, it's just a parallel example. It's a small section of the Quran that was offered to Iran as well. And this is in 2015, I guess. So are you talking about the second one, or are you talking about the first one?
No, I was talking about...
In general, about the idea
No,
of...
in general about the Persian manuscript.
Yes. Yes.
Also Russia.
Yes.
No really gift exchanges, but there's some other things.
Yes, yes. And the circulation before they got to the Topkapi or to the library in St. Petersburg, of course, holds many stories such as this one. One of them is of course, being part of the booty, yes. But manuscript, sorry, was before it reached before it reached Istanbul. So I don't know if it was in Tabriz. We don't have any evidence that says anything about it being in Tabriz or anywhere else.
No,
We know it was
Tabriz is after the manuscript.
Yeah.
I don't know any stories. I think it was maybe.
Yeah.
Also,
my question is for all three panelists, I guess, or whoever would like to answer. How do you think the religious nature of the text influences their mobility and in this way the knowledge they produce? And how is this knowledge and mobility different with regards to the circulation of myth or novels, as Dr. Gerard was referring to?
I think religious or not religion and then the expression of the culture. So it is culture. And these are cultural artifacts. Sometimes religious artifacts, sometimes other cultural artifacts. So I don't think it would definitely have an implication on the traffic that it is taking. Okay? And let's suppose that we talk about the Quran or tafsirs or whatever religious books. The way is, through direct talab al-ilm, it's prayed and traveling and going to the pilgrimage together. So one carries with her, one carries with him books of all kinds, all sorts. It could be a chemistry book, it could be a religious book, or other things. So these are first seen, I would see them myself, as cultural artifacts. Now ideas move as well. These are not artifacts, okay? They might be religious cultures. Then we have to study the whole sociological and political. We have to study the sociological and political aspects of this movement, of this wave of ideas and cultures, as well as other implications. Sometimes more than one thing would be affected by a certain ideological, let's put it this way, ideological background of a certain person, or the ideological and, if you want, the value of a certain artifact. Now, ideological comes under different things of interest. It's all cultural. I see a cultural scene in the very fine and composite relationship with social mobility, with social mobility and with power and politics. If this answers your question. So I don't want myself to differentiate much when it comes to traveling of ideas and traveling of books and traveling of artifacts as well. To differentiate. At some point we need to differentiate. But the differentiation comes always within the sphere, this hypothesis of social, political, and other aspects in real life.
So I think in the art market it has a different value. We have folios from dispersed manuscripts, whether they're important, whether they have historical, artistic value, or whether their value comes from the fact that they're old. The fact that they're religious texts Yes, it add value to these manuscripts and to their circulation, the way people perceive them. I had another point actually to say. Sorry, I completely forgot. Would you like to add something to that?
Well, I think that I can speak in Ethiopian context, and maybe religion in Ethiopian context means everything, because the religion is used as a means of explaining political ideologies since the introduction of Christianity in Ethiopia. The emperors were the first ones to receive the Christian religion, and in one way or the other, it is the reflection of power. If you are an Ethiopian, if you are in the Aksumite period, you have to be a Christian, otherwise you will not accept. You shouldn't be there. You have to live in exile, or you have to kill yourself, basically. So, in that context, religion means is a means of survival. So, books of religious books has to be circulated very rapidly, so as to people understand what that religion, whatever it is, what that religion means, and they have to believe what the emperors believe. In that way, they will be on the same track to understand the king's ideology. So, being a Christian is first being a Christian is like to be like God. So everybody has to accept this. Everybody has to accept this and try to live with the idea of this ideology. So the kings and the emperors make sure that everybody knows about this religion, in this case Christianity, in order to live. So I think it's a means of survival in the Ethiopian context. After the introduction of Islam in Ethiopia, it did also the same thing. Of course, there were sometimes quarrels and wars, but it does mean the same as the Christians. You have to be religious in order to exist in that place. I think that's why the manuscripts survived and circulated more.
So we have, is there one?
No.
I think we have time for just one more question, and then we'll be sure everyone's ready for lunch.
Maher, I was just intrigued by the title of the short story, Arabian Nights, which is Hasib Kalimatin, وملائكة الحياة. When I grew up reading Arabic literature, المكتبة الخضراء and what have you, the plural for the word servant was always either الثعابين or الأفاعي. So I'm very much intrigued by al-hayat, like in Lebanese dialect we say hayat, but I've never seen it in written form as al-hayat in a manuscript. It's usually al-tha'abin or al-afa'i. There are many words for that. So does this have any colloquial connotation at all, seeing as how the Arabian Nights do stem from a largely secular imagination and the lower strata of the population as opposed to the higher strata? Or is it just pure coincidence? Why hayat and not afa'i or ta'abin? Which to me, to my mind, and I'm not an expert on the Arabic language, you are, seem to have a slightly different connotation or denoting a different register within the Arabic language. That is my question for you.
Thanks to answer the question. By the way, hayya and hayat, pura hayat, thanks, it's brilliant. But I mean, the answer is there in your question. Hayya is classical Arabic, or high Arabic, and the pura hayat is as well high Arabic. Now the word we use here, الثعبان والثعابين, might be I'm not an expert on colloquial dialects. Now, if this story is of, we don't know its origin, by the way. There we have Gilgamesh is one of the hypertexts of the story. We have Jewish legends, all kinds of possible. Gilgamesh plays a basic role as well. Yeah, I'm not the expert on Egyptian dialect to say Hayya Jews the or I don't know. But only one thing, I wouldn't say secular in this context. I would say, yeah, colloquial, yeah, indeed, that's not secular. But Hayya is High Arabic, it's classical Arabic, dictionary. You find it in books, you find books on medicine as well. Now, Thu'ban, Thu'ban, Hanash, these are different, and Af'al, different names for different stages, if you want, in the life of a snake, or in the species of the snake, or in the sex, gender of the snake, or whatever. Yeah. All right, thank you. All ends up in a Taneen.
Yes. Thank you.
Don't try to interrupt, Mom. Thank you very much.
Thank you.